Hello and welcome to this week's Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law, editor of the Digest. Since we launched the podcast, it's been listened to by 250,000 people in countries right around the world. But it's not just our podcast that Arab Digest has to offer. Our daily reader-supported newsletter provides unique insights into the Middle East and North Africa. Here at Arab Digest, we have assembled a team of experts you'll not find anywhere else. For more on how to receive the newsletter free for 2 months, head to our website at arabdigest.org. My guest this week is Dr. Elisabeth Kendall, mistress and president of Cambridge University's Girton College, and an expert on militant jihadism, with a particular emphasis on Yemen and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Liz, great to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me again.
I want to discuss al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP. But before we get there, I'd like to get your thoughts on two recent events. The first is the release of the commercial vessel, the Galaxy Leader, and its crew by the Houthis after being held for more than a year. Of course, that seizure was part of the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea in support of Palestine. How do you understand the decision by the Houthis to release the Galaxy Leader?
Yes, there are a couple of ways of looking at the Houthi decision. The timing was, of course, highly intentional, as the Houthis had promised. They said that they would stop their bellicose activities when a ceasefire took place between Israel and Hamas. And so once that ceasefire was in place, the crew were released. So this was designed to demonstrate that they were being true to their rhetoric. And of course, it is wonderful after, I think it must have been 14 months in captivity that crew was released, and all credit to Oman for mediating that. But there is another way of looking at this. It was highly opportunistic because it also makes the Houthis look like they won. They look like the good guys. They played hardball. They attacked shipping, they've attacked Israel, and now they've got what they wanted. They can afford to be generous and keep their side of the bargain. But we do need to see this, I think, as a short-term tactical stunt, really. It's generating positive publicity for them. And it's hard to take it at face value. There are a couple of reasons for that. The Houthis are, of course, still holding well over 60 humanitarian and aid workers from the United Nations and other international organizations in detention. And indeed, they snatched a further 7 workers just last week. And I think that the rhetoric that we're hearing from the Houthi leader does emphasize that they're not really intending to stop their activities in the Red Sea and against Israel. He has, in fact, said that this is just a phase. And in fact, now what they want is not just the liberation of Palestine, but the destruction of Israel. So I do expect things to kick off again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the rhetoric is bold and aggressive. And it's been useful to the Houthi leadership, hasn't it? Because they control, 2/3 of the population of Yemen, and they've had a lot of support when otherwise people under their control are rather dismayed at the leadership. But this has been a bonus on the ground for them.
Yes, it has proven popular, and it's helped to revive their base and indeed to extend it at a time when, after 9, almost 10 years of war, it was certainly flagging. So it's played to their advantage.
Mm. Okay, and at almost the same time, Donald Trump has redesignated the Houthis as a terrorist organization. Now, I'm not going to ask you to get into the mind of Donald Trump, Liz, but what does that decision mean for the Houthis and for the broader question of regional de-escalation? Because Trump says, look, I'm the peacemaker. I'm going to bring peace to the region. But here he is designating the Houthis as a terrorist organization.
Well, he no doubt sees the designation as a tool towards peace in his definition. Of course, he wants to further isolate the Houthis. And it doesn't come as a surprise. He designated the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO, in his first term. Biden undid it. But there are a couple of facts worth remembering. Number one is that Trump only slapped on that FTO designation at the very, very end of his first term. It was more like a parting gift to his Gulf friends than a tool that was perhaps deemed to be useful towards peace. And Biden did in fact designate the Houthis. It was simply that, of course, his designation was a slightly lesser one. It was a specially designated global terrorist. And the reason for that was a good one. It was to avoid innocent civilians paying the price for Houthi terrorism. The Biden designation, that is one under which US financial institutions freeze Houthi funds, and they obviously ban them from travel. The FTO, on the other hand, that is dangerous for anyone suspected of providing support to the Houthis, possibly even just interacting with them, talking to them. So I think the important point here is that the debate isn't really about whether the FTO undertaken by Trump is deserved. I think most Yemen watchers agree that it is. It's about whether it's going to work. Is it going to halt Houthi attacks? Probably not. Is it going to harm civilians? It probably will. There are implications here for the conflict in Yemen itself. The risks of interacting with the Houthis means that it's going to be hard to pursue the United Nations roadmap towards peace. It's probably going to be impossible to entertain the idea of reuniting the central bank. And the Houthis will likely respond. They'll consider this an escalation. But I mean, maybe it's important also to mention that, on the other hand, I think it's fair to say that the status quo wasn't really working. Humanitarian organizations were finding it very hard to operate anyway in Houthi-controlled territory because their personnel were being arrested and detained. And of course, the Houthi leadership has far too many sources of funding. It gets funding from fuel smuggling, from tobacco, from telecoms. And even if Iran as a potential source of funding was drying up, then there were other possibilities, possibly Russia, possibly China. But what we do know is that it is going to hurt civilians at a time when about two-thirds of Yemen civilians, so about two-thirds, just under two-thirds of the population of 32, 34 million do need aid. So it's going to hurt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as ever, it's the civilians who pay the price for this geopoliticking that's going on. You mentioned Iran, and the Houthis, of course, are part of Tehran's now heavily degraded axis of resistance and its efforts to constrain and contain Israel. That's really been hammered heavily. Hamas and Hezbollah, together with the now departed Bashar al-Assad, being the cadres of that strategy, that asymmetric warfare strategy. Where do you see Iran now in the equation and in its links to the Houthis?
Yes, well, gosh, Iran and its links to the Houthis. I guess it's certainly safe to say that support to the Houthis from Iran is going to be diminishing, and that support to the anti-Houthi forces inside Yemen is likely increasing. But again, there are a couple of problems here. First, there's no strong, united alternative to the Houthis, not yet. Inside Yemen, the anti-Houthi forces are very divided. Their military is quite piecemeal. These are the government forces, the so-called government forces. In fact, there are southern separatist forces, and they're strong in the center and in the west of the south of Yemen. There are the Giants brigades on the west coast, and now there's the National Shield forming more in the south and the southeast. And the second problem is that it's going to take time for Iran's diminished help to the Houthis to actually show. The Houthis do have an arsenal, and they're adept at hiding their weapons. And Iran's game was always to empower and enable the Houthis. So the Houthis are quite capable of acting independently and producing arms domestically. And even if those weapons that they're producing are not the same caliber and sophistication as Iran, that doesn't really matter because their battle is an asymmetric one, and the quality and accuracy just isn't that important. They need to keep going. That's the main thing. And of course, at the same time, there are some unintended consequences of degrading Iran and degrading Hamas and Hezbollah. And that one of those is that the Houthi standing within the axis of resistance is growing. At least In the short term, it is. And the Houthis may even see this as an opportunity in a couple of ways. For starters, it's a propaganda gift for them. They are now the great defenders of Palestine against the huge enemy Zionist US. And they aspire to leadership themselves within the axis of resistance. They've been making collaborations, they've been really keen to extend the axis as well, making overtures to Shia militias in Iraq, groups like al-Shabaab in East Africa. So I think this could work for them, at least in the short term.
And Iran, Liz, where is Iran in all of this?
I was quite interested to listen to what Mohammad Jawad Zarif had to say at Davos last week. This is, of course, Iran's vice president for strategic affairs. He stressed, of course, that Iran's power doesn't derive only from its military capability or the resistance group, the groups that it funds. And he obviously didn't acknowledge that Hamas or Hezbollah were proxies. So he said that Iran also derives power from its ideology and its ability to use that to move people to act. And that struck me as quite significant. Now, you could just take that to mean Iran's ideological stance finds some kind of support from those who oppose Israel and defend Palestine. But I thought he gave it a lot of weight. And it struck me that this is a powerful catalyst for action that Iran has. And it was quite reminiscent to me of how al-Qaeda works. It uses ideology as a weapon. And why does this matter? Well, if we think of Iran's levers, we tend to think of three things. We think of Iran's own military capability, and that lever has been significantly weakened. We think of Iran's proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, and the Assad regime, and all of that's been significantly weakened. And we think of Iran's nuclear threat. Well, that's still in play. But there's a fourth lever to which we pay a lot less attention, and that's Iran's steady penetration of al-Qaeda and its influences within that network over the past few years. And we should be paying that a lot more attention.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Well, that takes me to my next question. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, still in play, and as you were saying, Iran working with AQAP. You've charted over many years the ebb and flow of AQAP. And I saw a tweet of yours the other day, which highlighted their claim that the wildfires in Los Angeles are Allah's punishment for Israel's war on the Palestinians. That's interesting.
Yes, that is interesting. And it's probably predictable, but noteworthy nonetheless. Palestine is always at the heart of what drives al-Qaeda as an ideology. It's front and center of its propaganda, and it's what it uses to globalize its jihad. Now, there is this mention of the Los Angeles forest fires in the al-Qaeda statement last week, I think it was, it makes you think. And there is a question in my mind about the extent to which recent terror acts are joined up and the possibility of an external actor, shall we say, coordinating or at least helping them along. In the US, we've seen the New Orleans truck attack, we've seen the Tesla Cybertruck exploding outside Trump Towers, and we've seen the LA fires. And I do remember that the anniversary video from Al-Qaeda last year, so the most recent anniversary video, this is from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, it was Ibrahim al-Tusi giving an address, and he called it Reflections on the Two Invasions, not just the one invasion or the one raid. Or so normally they just talk about 9/11 and the attack on the Twin Towers, but this past year they talked about that and coupled it together with the Al-Aqsa flood, the 7th of October 2023 Hamas attacks on Israel. So that was really interesting. They coupled those two great events in their minds together. And one of the elements in that video was to urge forest fires
Mm.
and martyrdom operations. So I don't know. I mean, it's easy to become paranoid, and I know 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5, but let's keep all of these things in play. I guess what we do know for sure is that Gaza has become a hook for jihad, and that these groups, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula particularly, are harnessing this conflict to fuel their narratives. And it's helped them revive because, of course, their landing page in all of their videos has always been that the way each video ends is on the words Qadimun ya Aqsa, we're coming, Aqsa, Jerusalem, we're coming. And that now has a whole new meaning.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and Elisabeth Kendall, an expert on al-Qaeda. To find out more about what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to get our daily newsletter for 2 months for free. Check us out on arabdigest.org. We've talked about this in the past, about how much of al-Qaeda leadership in the Arabian Peninsula, how much it has been degraded by U.S. drone strikes. But is al-Qaeda regrouping in Yemen? Are we seeing a kind of a reemergence?
Well, it's certainly active, or at least propaganda and attacks and activity are all happening under the al-Qaeda label. But it's difficult to know just how similar today's al-Qaeda is to the group that existed 10 years ago. So I think one element to bring out here is that there does appear to be some kind of tactical collaboration now between al-Qaeda and the Houthis. Now, that does sound counterintuitive because of what we know to be sectarian divisions. The Houthis are on the Shiite side of the spectrum, and the al-Qaeda franchise is, of course, on the extreme Sunni jihadi side of the spectrum. So they're not natural partners, but in some cases, your mutual enemy is stronger than your mutual enmity.
Mm.
And some of the evidence for that, well, first of all, it's striking that there have been no al-Qaeda attacks whatsoever against the Houthis for 2.5 years, since June 2022. Their sole target has been southern forces who collaborate with the Yemeni government nominally, but they are separatist forces in the south of Yemen. And the Houthi MO of drone activity and drone strikes seems to have been transferred to al-Qaeda. There's been a great increase in al-Qaeda drone strikes. This is drone strikes by al-Qaeda, not against al-Qaeda, in the last couple of years. And a couple of other things. There was a statement put out by al-Qaeda in July last year, or actually just at probably the beginning of August. It was after the Israeli airstrikes on Houdaida in Yemen. And that statement, gosh, it could have been written by the Houthis themselves. It talked about the need to defend the Red Sea and keep it for Islam, and calling it an Islamic sea, and criticizing Israel for its bombing of, didn't say Houthi-held territory, of course, it said Yemen. So I guess what this says is that, sometimes partnerships are pragmatic, and that necessity overrides immediate ideology. So I would watch this space, and I had a couple of things that I'd worry about are, if these two groups are indeed collaborating, okay, they're not partners, but they might be collaborating, then I'd watch out for 2 anniversaries. Al-Qaeda loves anniversaries. There might be attacks planned. One is the end of March, which marks 10 years since al-Qaeda overran Mukalla in 2015. And another would be October this year, because that is the 25th anniversary of al-Qaeda's bombing of the USS Cole off the coast of Aden, and that could provoke some kind of maritime attack to commemorate that.
Yeah, and do you think that, this reconstituted al-Qaeda has that sort of capability now?
Well, I don't think that it's particularly strong on its own. There is infighting and the activity is quite diffuse, but with a bit of external help, I could imagine that it's possible. Yeah.
Mm. And you mentioned their drone. Who are they targeting, al-Qaeda, with their drone attacks?
They're targeting the forces that are aligned with the Southern Transitional Council, forces which are nominally under the government umbrella, but which seek ultimately a separate southern state. These are the forces that are being targeted by al-Qaeda exclusively.
Mm. And of course, those forces are backed by the United Arab Emirates. And I'm thinking too that al-Qaeda's target has always been, well, the ruling families in the Gulf, but particularly the Al Saud. And could
Yes,
you see that?
there's never an operational claim put out by al-Qaeda that doesn't refer to these southern forces as UAE mercenaries. That's always the way in which they're labeled, very
Mm.
much directed against the Gulf.
Yeah, those ruling families. Yeah. Donald Trump, as I mentioned earlier, he's declared he wants to be the peacemaker. Now, the Saudis are very keen, and have been for some time, to have a deal with the Houthis and to get out of the quagmire that they walked into back in 2015. But the Houthi leadership is being, well, what, coy about signing a deal? I mean, where do you see this all headed in the next few months? And could AQAP attempt to upend a peace deal?
Yeah, there's a real dilemma here. Saudi has been trying to exit the Yemen war by reaching an agreement with the Houthis that would pave the way for a United Nations-led roadmap. But this looks increasingly unlikely. The roadmap doesn't include a Houthi ceasefire in the Red Sea, a halt to Houthi activities in the Red Sea. Now, I know these are temporarily halted, but I don't think that's going to last. And it's been solely domestically focused. So it's not about Houthi activity towards Israel or maritime activity. And you simply can't realistically compartmentalize these different conflicts. And, the problem here is that on the one hand, if the Saudis sign that deal and get out of Yemen, then the Houthis can make a run for it, grab more territory, escalate. And the roadmap that would hopefully lead to is really problematic now because any power sharing agreement that leaves the Houthis, at least in their current form and under their current leadership, in charge of parts of the Red Sea coast simply isn't acceptable because they can always hold shipping to ransom. And on the other hand, if the goalposts are changed now with the Houthis, with signing that peace deal with Saudi Arabia and with the roadmap, the Houthis are unlikely to take that very well, and they could easily revert to including Saudi as a target. And that's very worrying for Saudi because they've seen all of these drones and missiles being lobbed over their territory towards Israel. And of course, they themselves suffered over 1,000 drone and missile attacks from the Houthis between 2015 and 2022, when an uneasy truce was signed. So the challenge is that the Houthis are under pressure, but they're not under enough pressure to just compromise and cave in. And it's very unlikely that Israeli airstrikes, US airstrikes, UK airstrikes can make a difference, at least not in the short term, because okay, Israel was quite successful with Hamas and with Hezbollah, but the challenge of the Houthis is quite different. For starters, they're much further away, over 2,000 kilometers away. They're not neighbors. The Houthi terrain is mountainous. They have strongholds. The size of that terrain that's held by the Houthis is massive. It's about 20 times the size of Lebanon, the area that the Houthis have control over. It's about 500 times the size of Gaza. And the populations that the Houthis control are just much, much bigger. About roughly 20 million people live in Houthi areas. So there does need to be some kind of regional coalition if the Houthis are going to be significantly challenged, and it probably would need to involve ground forces. So I think there's a good chance that the civil war in Yemen may re-escalate.
And al-Qaeda in all of that?
Al-Qaeda it's not a big player, it's not a big deal in its own right. It becomes, however, a useful tool for another actor, other actors in the conflict to use, particularly to use as a proxy that gives them plausible deniability. So, and I think prime amongst the actors I'm talking about would be the Houthis. If the war re-escalates inside Yemen, then al-Qaeda, bits and pieces of it, could prove a very useful foil for the Houthis to use within the south, and particularly within the southeast of Yemen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's just finally, you painted what a rather scary scenario that we could see what boots on the ground military action from the Israelis, from perhaps the Gulf states, from even the Americans, despite Trump's declaration of wanting to be the peacemaker. What are the solutions? We're looking at, as you said, 10 years of civil war. Yemen has suffered so much, the people have suffered so much. Do you look at it and see any bright spots?
Do I see any bright spots? Well, I think there are several things that we could do. I think the will is there now internationally and inside Yemen within the anti-Houthi camp to really sort this out finally. And we understand that the Houthis really are a problem. They've got international attention. So what needs to be done? First of all, sidelining the hardliners within the Houthi movement, promoting the moderates, and that requires a mix of measures, not just kinetic. Second, got to close down Houthi sources of funding. The FTO might help that, but they do have well-trodden workarounds. Got to align the regional actors to unite the anti-Houthi forces inside Yemen so they have a common goal and support a united Presidential Leadership Council. And finally, we've got to tackle Houthi propaganda. Unless we tackle the Houthi propaganda machine, I don't think we're going to get anywhere fast, and certainly nowhere in the long term. The Houthis have an incredible machinery of social media channels, a TV station, a website, and this means that the areas which they control are simply not getting alternative worldviews, interpretations. And it's not just that they're putting out news and statements, but their material is really culturally attuned. There's lots of poetry, song, and the constant repetition of this, the mono messaging, the simple concepts, catchy tunes, bold lyrics, this sinks in, and it's a recipe for ongoing cycles of violence that are going to outlast any peace agreement, even if one comes to pass. So, okay, I understand why one needs to focus on taking out missile launchers and weapons arsenals, but we also need to take out the apparatus that indoctrinates the forthcoming generations. And arguably, that's more important. So this whole propaganda, this winning of hearts and minds, needs a lot more attention. And without addressing this, the conflict may diminish, but it's never going to end.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking Palestine is such a lightning rod. Were there to be a solution for the Palestinians, at least that lightning rod would be taken away from the propaganda efforts that the Houthis have.
I think that's right. I think that removing the main ingredient of propaganda, i.e., taking out the Palestinian issue by enabling Palestinian statehood, would go a long way towards turning extremist narratives, whether they're from the Houthis or al-Qaeda, into damp squibs. It just takes away their ace card.
Well, we'll leave it there, and hopefully that ace card can be pulled out from under these jihadist groups. Liz, thanks again. Thanks so much.
Bill, it's a pleasure as ever. Thanks for the invitation.
You've been listening to the Arab Digest podcast. My guest today was the Arabist and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula expert, Elisabeth Kendall. To find out more about Arab Digest and our reader-supported daily newsletter, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you'll find details on how to receive the newsletter for 2 months for free. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.